Okay, there's a lot of theories on the Sphinx and a lot of mysteries around it, and I'm going to touch upon a few of them and the ancient erosion that's around it and different aspects of it to give maybe a wholer overview on it for everyone and just to refresh. I have an older video about this, but it's on the other site. There's only about 400. The last 400 are on this site, and it's back on the other one way back when. It must be almost 1,000 videos ago now. But and I've talked about it slightly on a few other videos, but I wanted to touch upon this one more time just to bring it up to fresh. And I've got a slightly different look onto it and a different vision. This is something a guy's got, and you can always look this up. It's got an idea that says what King Arthur said about the ancient pyramids and stuff. And I'll do a short one on this and credit the author with it, that the guy has the book about it and a video that corresponds to that I've went over to. But this isn't about that. This is about the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids, of course, and its mysteries. And I want you to see here, this is etched before Napoleon came through. And apparently this is what the pyramid looked like before he supposedly shot its nose off with a couple of cannonballs or some crap, like the old story goes. And they said that they knocked the pharaoh's things off, but you can see that was already gone a long time ago. And interestingly, in this picture, there doesn't appear to be the snake on his head in any way, shape, or form, or a bulb that would have been where the snake would be. And I don't know if you really pick it up in this picture here. I don't know if I can cut the contrast down here. Let me see. Doesn't look like it gets any darker or richer than that, but right down here, the erosion around the neck and how long this neck goes down before it would start to form the shoulders. Now, we're going to look at the new Sphinx, or the Sphinx that they've reset and put all the bricks back around the neck and the shoulders and things back on to recreate it, because it had pieced out and really gotten pretty terrible. And I'm sure some people stole some stones too. They literally built the town there just outside of the pyramid grounds out of a lot of the stones that are here for some of the other pyramids, and just all over the place just to make them. But interesting little fact here is the way it supposedly used to look. There's 3 or 4 etchings from back then that people had taken. This is one of those, and it also shows the way that the Great Pyramid looked and how it was pretty raggedy, you know, all the way up into the top. Nothing special on top that should have been there or anything. And even how there's a little bit of creasing on the sides of it. You can see it's done at a slight angle, and that's the angle of the ramp that ran around and around and around in a corkscrew all the way around the pyramid that they built it out of. And we're not talking about the building of the pyramids this time. We're talking about other things. Let me cut to the chase here and go to the Sphinx, and we'll talk about some more about the erosion. Now, there's a few other ancient etchings here that actually show the pyramids are set underwater. And some of these are not personal accounts of actually being there. And some of them come from the story of Herodotus, who said that there was an ancient Lake Moeris that had 2 pyramids into it. They were a little more angled up than the Great Pyramids, in other words, a little pointier. And in doing so, kind of like the bent pyramid, but if you were not to have bent it and gone straight up, that angle. And that on top of them, they seem to have some statuary facing the east. And I don't know if the other one has one facing the west, or if they're both facing the east, if this was meant to be a husband and wife pair situation. There's a lot of speculation on that. But there's also speculation that there was a lot of times whenever the entire Nile Valley would flood out. And you know that they used to use canals. In a couple of my videos, in some of CFAP's videos, he'll show you the canal work that runs right up from satellite images. You can see where the ancient canal works, where they would actually cut a canal, except for right at the Nile, all the way back to the site they were going to build a pyramid out. Then they would cut the in-between piece, and it would flood in, and that's where they would start bringing the stones up so they didn't have to drag them so far. And of course, stone weighs a lot less in water. They could keep them somewhat in a half-submerged state, buoyant by wood, and bring them in. And so there's a lot of that was going on, and surely there was one or more running up to each one of these, or even to each side, things along that nature. But also in that fact, whenever it used to really rain hard up, south of here, which would have been upstream, the Nile runs backwards. And of course, running from the delta south is actually going to upper Egypt. It's kind of backwards, but then again, to them, it was upper land and lower land in the way that the river ran. So this rainfall that used to happen a lot would quite often flood out their whole area, and there were literally settlements that were on the higher ground that people had to go to when this happened, and they'd have to let it quell back down. And never got to biblical floods or things like that, but I'm sure it flooded over the whole plain and got the whole thing set up. In fact, there's remnants of like a little barrier wall that's around the Great Pyramid, and it kind of lends to the idea that there might have been like a seawall there just in case it got big to kind of help protect it. Now, when you go all the way down to the bottom of the Great Pyramid and some of the sites here, you'll actually go down to the bottom of it and hit water, like at the Osirian and places like that quite often have standing water in there. And that's because that's the water table. The water table is only in very, very many places in a huge amount of area through here, depending on rainfall and the river flow that seeps out into the land and keeps it up. It'll be 15 foot up on below the ground. Not that far, so it doesn't take much to totally saturate the land. And then, of course, this bisque land becomes a mud type thing and or a silt, and in the process too would flood over a whole lot easier than, in fact, it's known as a floodplain. Okay, so it floods over a whole lot easier because of those effects. But now let's take this to the Sphinx, actually, and this concept of idea. There's always been a lot of great controversy on what the Sphinx was or what it originally was. It definitely looks to people like it's been redone. And you can tell that now that it's eroding away, that it's not done under one solid block, but there are these giant blocks that are lined through his body and his face that are all smoothed off. And at one time, there even used to be a coloring on this thing. Okay? So they had repainted it at one time and kind of dolled it up. And you can tell right here there's a break where this shouldn't actually come down and do that break. Now, if it wiggled and came over his front shoulders, that would be one thing, but it doesn't because he's a lion, so it doesn't have that effect. And if you look at it from the other side, it literally looks like it's been chopped off right here and a new head put on it. But there's a lot of belief it used to be Anubis, and I'm kind of kin to that idea because whenever you look at the tail of this thing, if you were to take Anubis and just cut his head off and put a Egyptian pharaoh's head on it, like one of these guys here, it would look just like this. And people say, well, that's got to be lion paws. If you look at Anubis's paws, they look just like this. And so it's really not any different. This is a great shot here where it shows the pyramid behind and things, but this is set in the ground, of course. And so let's look at a picture of some of these erosion patterns. Okay, now these erosion patterns, this is what the interior walls look like around the Sphinx. And this is what has given a lot of people, and of course we always credit a lot of it to Robert Schoch, who's knows enough about geology to see erosion patterns. And he noticed that this didn't look like sand and wind erosion. I mean, the deep vent cuts are that are horizontal, but the fact of the way that it runs down and you get those clefts in it, that's done by water. And it's done by a lot of water. Like you see on the right-hand side picture, where they've dramatized a lot of rain falling on this and etching into it and puddling up in the bottom of it a little bit. Well, so this must be right at the start of a good rain, and it's puddling and falling over the sides. And so it runs in like this. And then all around the Sphinx would become submerged, and then there'd just be a little puddle of water around him, like a little moat, which would be a cool effect. And I'm not sure that's not the way they almost kept it whenever this was a full floodplain. It could have been a source of water for all we know. around that, and that they thought it purified it from the water. There's no real inscription that tells you what the use was for around it, although the temple behind it has descriptions and things. The Sphinx itself only has strange stories like Amenhotep III's, where he had this dream out in front of it and then dug the Sphinx out and it made him the king whenever he wasn't necessarily supposed to be. But that could be, of course, just a telling of how somebody becomes divinity. And there's always a tale where the human person becomes divinity. In fact, all the ancient gods seem to be deified people that went all through. And of course, the Egyptians were the impersonation of God on this earth. And whenever the Romans and Greeks were in power, they were also their depiction of God, which goes through Caesar and Titus and things, which locks into the whole Jesus thing if you look at some of my other videos. But we're not on that today. Look at this erosion that's here and in this nose-looking rock that's right here, and how it runs down, and the clefts that run between it. This clefts that run between it and how it's poured through and eaten through there and comes out here in this one spot is so telling of how it ran across here and etched into it deep, but finally eroded into a crack that was back here, and it's eroding through these cracks. And water running through those cracks, our water is exaggerating them. Sand wouldn't necessarily exaggerate like this. Sand makes a bunch of lines like this. Have you ever seen Utah or some of the desert things and how it erodes sand and the predominant wind from one side causes an effect? There's no predominant wind thing going on in here, and it's sunk down. And it got full of sand. When they found it, it was full of sand. So how could this erosion happen when it was in a protected environment full of sand? Well, how about if it's full of sand and this water's still falling in like this? Because this is hard bedrock here, and the sand that's in there not. The sand just becomes saturated, and this whole thing right here is all like a drain. And so it allows it to drain out. Now we know there's cavities up under that Sphinx, and they've shown now where you can climb down into them and do things like that. And it's very a possibility that the water table would pull down and pull it down, and so this thing very much like a drain. And instead of it having to have so much rain all the time, and it being some great floods from 10,000 years ago, which they know for a fact that you have to go back about 6, 7, 8,000 years before they have a level of rainfall that would have to fall for a few thousand years in a regular annual thing, not some great flood deal, but just an annual rainfall that would procure something like this on the right happening enough in enough succession to cause the amount of erosion that you see here on the left. Okay, hopefully you followed me on that. But the oddity here is that I think that instead of it happening with all this floods in 10,000 years and so on, the Nile had a hiccup flood thing all the time, and it would come down into this valley quite often. There are ancient etchings and people talking about the water being all the way up to the bottom of the pyramids and things like that. And through that whole area, how it would flood out whenever it got over flooded. When you had that too much rain situation, it would get up tall through this area, and even though this was somewhat on higher ground, it would become submerged, but it would suck down into, flowing over and down into, so eroding quite rapidly. Not some little drainage like this, but imagine if it drained a whole lot faster, because we have the whole plain above this up here all flooded, 1-2 foot deep, and it is pouring into this false sink drain that's full of sand, right? And then so the water in here would be down maybe to this level where you see this line, or perhaps it quite often was exactly at this level, hint, hint, and that was a main level for it, but it would get totally full and then do that. And so this is a drain level that would be common for it, and it would get large amounts of flow, perhaps 10, 20 times this, but less often than we're thinking of it having to be back 10,000 years. But maybe this did only happen 5, 6,000 years ago, whenever they actually did have decent amalgamated rainfall, and even writing that says that they had terrible floods in the area and things that happened. In fact, a lot of their famines were caused whenever things totally overflooded what they should have, and then following that, there'd be a time of famine. So, because it ruined all their crops. You know, you can imagine if it flooded in and ruined all your crop, then what were you going to have in the end of the year for the harvest? But I digress, like I always do. Interesting fact here, though, I don't think this happened as long ago as people try to give credit for. I think that it happened very much so, maybe in half that amount of time, or less, if it was to use the hyper effect that I'm talking about, rather than the slow erosion of some rainfall that happened 20 times a year and fell enough to where half that time it would flow in these little rivulets. How about that the rainfall and the Nile flooding over because of rainfall and all the water coming from the north, or not north, but south up the Nile, that they would get from all the way from Lake Tanganyika and Malawi and Victoria and wash all down with it, that overflooding would cause a larger amount than what we see here on the right, exaggerated to the point that it would cause a lot more erosion than what this on the right does in its small amount of time, and that would cause this effect here in a lot less amount of the time. You know, it's more of like a quantity versus quality type situation whenever you look at things like what I'm saying here. And even though I agree with Robert Schoch somewhat, and a lot of people do, it put things out of range. And that freaks people out, and then they don't even want to listen to you. Well, it doesn't have to be out of range. It could, but it doesn't have to be. And you can get closer and closer and closer to the date that they think that it really was there and built by the method I'm talking about. Like, share, and subscribe, guys, and more interesting vids coming up shortly. Peace. Have a great day.